Hi, I'm John McAlpin, and I'm the SEO Director at Cardinal Digital Marketing. And today, we're going to talk about WordPress site speed. Now, we've all seen articles and guides about why site speed is important, what are core web vitals, but very rarely do they actually talk about how to improve your site speed. They give very general advice, but no hard concrete tactics. So today, I'm going to give you some key steps that you can take home and anyone can do to improve your WordPress site speed. Now, a little about me. I'm the SEO Director at Cardinal Digital Marketing, the leading healthcare digital marketing agency in the US. I'm also a regular contributor to Search Engine Journal and do some freelance WordPress development as well. The best way to contact me is through Twitter at SEO Counseling. In this presentation, I'll be sharing several resources for you to use. In no way do I expect anyone to write these down fast enough, so I've created a full list of all resources mentioned in this presentation directly on my website. With helpful links and articles to help you through everything I discussed today, the only link you need to remember today is johnmcalpin.com/SOS2021. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty, let's discuss some of the most common site speed obstacles that happen on websites. Hands down, one of the most common site speed issues I see on websites is unoptimized images. There are so many ways to properly deploy images that it would take an entirely separate presentation to cover it all. But here are the top 7 pieces of advice taken directly from Google's developer docs. Let's go ahead and dive into the first one. An opportunity that you may have seen pop up in your page speed insights reports might mention something about next-gen images or WebP images. WebP images are an evolution of JPEG and PNG images that are 26% smaller than PNGs and 25 to 34% smaller than comparable JPEG images. This means that your web pages will have a whole lot less weight to load with these WebP images. Something else that Google recommends is choosing the right level of image compression. Now, when we break it all down, image compression is about removing the unnecessary metadata behind the scenes of each image and reducing the overall file size. Now, how aggressive you want to compress your images has an impact on the overall quality of your images. To simplify things, there are really 2 types of compression, lossy and lossless. They're appropriately named because they're fairly self-explanatory. You'll have much smaller file sizes with lossy compression, but much higher quality images with lossless. The choice is really yours. One of the most common site speed issues related to images that I see is incorrect image dimensions. What happens is webmasters are uploading the original images, which are typically quite large, and then the browser is resizing them based on the specific dimensions given by the HTML or CSS. Let's take a look at this basketball. I downloaded this image at 1000 by 1000 pixels with a total file size of 151 kilobytes. When a user visits my basketball web page, the browser fetches that image and loads it at its intrinsic size, meaning the original size. However, as the code gets parsed and rendered in the browser, the image then resizes the preset dimensions given in the HTML or CSS. This is bad for 2 reasons. 1, it retains its full file size of 151 kilobytes, and 2, it can cause something called cumulative layout shift, which is when the layout of a web page shifts as the image is resized. Now, you might be wondering why we're on slide 4 now of image optimization. The reason for that is that images are hands down one of the most common issues for site speed, and cleaning up your images can have a dramatic effect on your overall page speed. There are a ton of desktop and online tools out there to help you optimize images, but wouldn't it be better if we could optimize images on the fly as we upload them to our WordPress site? Here are my top 3 image optimization plugins. However, if you're willing to pay a small fee, Imagify is my personal favorite because it provides several levels of compression options and can generate and deploy WebP images directly on your website. All 3 of these tools, plus a bonus one not mentioned here, are all featured on my status search resources page at johnmcalpin.com/SOS2021. The second biggest obstacle I see most WordPress sites have is the use of Wysiwyg Themes. Wysiwyg is an acronym for what you see is what you get. Some common Wysiwyg themes include WP Bakery, Elementor, Divi, and Visual Composer. but there are several others as well. On the back end, it often has a drag and drop interface and attempts to replicate the design of the actual web page. These themes are so prevalent because of their ease of use and because they come loaded with pre-built features that you can simply drag onto your page. No coding required. However, the biggest downfall is that in order to provide so many of these out-of-the-box features, they have an enormous amount of wasted code. You can use tools like Sitebulb to do code coverage reports and see how much code is actually wasted on your website. Now, what do we do about this? Well, good news. There are two tools that you can use that I highly recommend. Asset Cleanup Pro and Perf Matters. I'm partial to Asset Cleanup Pro, but Perf Matters provides a similar level of features. And what these tools do is allow you to dequeue or remove files from actually loading either site-wide or page by page. Now be careful. When you're dequeuing files, make sure that you always test. Even if your code coverage report says that the page isn't using those files, click around. It could be that clicking on a pop-up renders that code, or clicking on an accordion renders that code. You need to make sure that you test every feature of these pages when you're removing these files so that the users have the optimal experience. Another common site speed issue comes from the foundation, web hosting. Now later in this presentation, I'll dive deeper into what to look for in a web host, but for now, if you have a WordPress site, I highly recommend you look into one of these three web hosts. I've done countless hours of research and testing, and in my experience, these are the top 3 web hosts for WordPress. Now a disclaimer, I am an agency partner of Flywheel, so I'm going to be partial to their web hosting services. However, I've listed all 3 of these on my State of Search resources page, johnmcalpin.com/SOS2021. Another site speed obstacle, especially for large organizations, is having too many third-party scripts. Oftentimes, digital marketers go a little nuts with their Google Tag Manager and tools. Sometimes it's heat map tracking, sometimes it's different pixels and trackers. But in the end, it's all third-party code that requires a DNS fetch, a file request, and more code for the browser to parse and render. If you find yourself with a Google Tag Manager account that looks like this, what you need to do is prune the garden. Sift through every third-party script and ask yourself, do I actually need this? What value does this bring to my organization? If it's not currently needed, prune that weed. Excessive plugins is another common site speed issue that many of us are familiar with. Scan through your current plugins. If it looks anything like this, red flag. It's once again time to prune the garden. Delete inactive plugins. Make sure all active ones are updated. Enable auto updates. And remove any plugins that are not currently being used. Zero or poor caching settings can make a huge difference with your page speed. Caching is the action of storing files on your browser and on web servers in an effort to reduce fetch requests and server bandwidth. For example, in the image below, a user loads a web page. Then the browser fetches the web page files from the server, but on the way back, the user's browser caches the web files in a stored repository. That way, any future requests will come from the browser's cache, not the web server. This will result in faster page loads and less server requests. Along with browser caching, many web hosts, like the 3 mentioned previously, offer server-level caching. This works similar to browser caching, but at the server level. Many of these web hosts are transitioning into a cloud-based caching system, which helps make caching more stable and deploy much faster. There are tons of caching plugins for WordPress, some better than others. When it comes to caching for WordPress, make sure you reduce the amount of plugins necessary and find a plugin that not only handles browser caching, but other site speed tricks as well. On my State of Search resources page, I've listed some of the top caching plugins for WordPress. My personal favorite is WP Rocket, and I've even linked to a guide I made giving you the latest optimal settings for WordPress. Now that we've covered the most common site speed obstacles, it's time to dive into improving our WordPress site speed. But before we start downloading plugins or chipping away at code, we need to set up some benchmarks and tracking. The first place I like to look is in Search Console. Google provides us historic Core Web Vitals metrics at an aggregate level, breaking this up into poor, needs improvement, and good. If you want to get even more granular, you can set up a Crux speed monitoring dashboard in Google Data Studio and get a historic look at your Core Web Vitals. On my State of Search resources page, I have a link that will show you how to set up your own Google Data Studio dashboard with historic field data from Google's Crux report. One of my favorite site speed monitoring tools is WattSpeed. WattSpeed is a free tool that takes minutes to set up. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that WattSpeed has helped me save my clients hundreds of thousands of dollars by identifying dips in site speed and quickly recovering it. Take a look at the chart in the bottom right. Each of these dips equated to a reduction of 17% in conversion rates, which for that client was over $100K. WattSpeed is a must for tracking your performance. Now that we have some tracking set up, it's time to take some initial tests with a few free tools. PageSpeed Insights is going to be what most clients judge you on. However, tools like GTmetrix and Web Page Test will give you much more accurate reports on your actual speed. My recommendation is to download reports from all of these tools so that you can compare them with your final results. Better to have everything than nothing. All of these tools are listed on my State of Search resource page. Time for a hard truth. You may not be able to fix everything that comes up on the opportunities report, but that's okay. Focus on things that you can actually fix. Talk to your dev team and see what support they can lend. Talk to your stakeholders in the website and be upfront with them. Tell them about these roadblocks before you start, so that they're not shocked when it's not resolved. Be honest with yourself and those involved in your site speed endeavors. Time for the fun stuff. I like to call this phase housekeeping. It's what we do as our foundational efforts to start our site speed project. These are the tasks that should be deployed on all sites. Let's dive in. Step 1 is our site speed motto: prune the garden. Audit Google Tag Manager and all of those third-party scripts. Update your plugins and remove any unused ones. Have heat map tracking? Unless you're actively collecting new data, go ahead and remove that script from the site. If you're actively using heat map tracking, make sure it's only deployed on the specific pages you're tracking. Those scripts take up a lot of weight. Check with your web host and make sure that your website is running the latest version of PHP. If it's not, see if your host can update it for you. Most of them will. If you're currently using site speed plugins and your score still isn't great, then there's something at the foundational level that we need to fix first. Disable those plugins so that we can get a better idea of what the real problems are. Step 3. It might be time for a host migration. In an earlier slide, I mentioned that I was a big fan of Flywheel, WP Engine, and Kinsta. That's because all of them meet my checklist of must-haves in a WordPress host. If you think your host might be the problem, keep these considerations in mind. Make sure that they're on Nginx servers. Most of these antiquated hosts that I see are still on Apache, and Nginx servers basically are about 2.5 times faster than Apache servers. Make sure that you're on dedicated hosting or a cloud-based hosting network. Many of the web hosts you get, especially with people like GoDaddy, are going to be on shared servers, meaning you're sharing the bandwidth with all these other websites. Get on a dedicated host or a cloud-based host. Make sure that your host is going to offer server-level caching and will provide free SSL certificates. Most hosts nowadays are partnering with Let's Encrypt to deliver free SSL certificates that renew every 90 days so that you're not only getting a free SSL, but you have the latest and greatest security benefits installed. When choosing a host, you're going to have different plans available. And you'll see all these different pricing things. You may not know what to look for. Check on how much traffic they can expect to get and try to make sure you get twice your monthly traffic. So take a look at your sessions and analytics and see what your average monthly sessions are and try to go for twice that. Make sure you can handle capacity for spikes because we're looking at improvement here and you want room to grow. Then you're going to have bandwidth. See what your current host is telling you your website size is and try to get some storage for 2 to 3 times that current size because you'll be adding images and files and pages over time, and again, we want room to grow. Step 4 is to set up a CDN. There are a ton of great CDNs out there, but I highly recommend Cloudflare. Even though it's not a CDN in the traditional sense, Cloudflare still operates the same way and has one of the largest amounts of edge servers out there. For those new to the concept, CDNs are an additional layer outside of your web host. Let's say your web host is based in India. Then users in China and Australia visit your website. It takes different amounts of time for the data on your original server to travel to China and Australia than it would for users in your home country of India. That's where the CDN comes into play. The CDN has edge servers all over the world that cache your web files in physical locations closest to your site's visitors. Now, what happens when we scale this globally? With edge servers all over the world, we can spread out our caching capabilities, reducing bandwidth on your web server and improving site speed for users. On average, I see upwards of 10 plus points improved on overall Core Web Vital scores whenever setting up a CDN. Step 5 is to set up your image optimization. Find the right image optimization plugin. Again, I strongly recommend Imagify. Make sure all of your images are properly sized to only the dimensions required for your web pages. Ensure that your plugin is generating WebP versions of your images. Finally, use a crawling tool like Screaming Frog or Sitebulb or OnCrawl to identify unoptimized images so that you can fine-tune your images across your entire website. Step 6 is to set up your caching plugin. In an earlier slide, we covered a few of my favorite caching plugins. Check with your web host to see if these plugins are compatible. You may find that there are additional settings involved to make them compatible. Do not combine multiple caching plugins. It should go without saying, but this is a recipe for failure, but it's a recipe I see on so many websites. Do not enable preloading on your caching and speed optimization plugins. It may sound like a good idea, but preloading can degrade your server performance over time and end up making your website slower in the long run. Step 7 is to set up your Turnkey speed plugin. Hopefully you found a plugin that can handle both caching and page speed at the same time. Here are some of the top speed plugins out there. While WP Rocket is my favorite, I've been impressed with the performance from NitroPack. However, if you're operating multiple websites or have a very large website, NitroPack's pricing model doesn't really make sense, and WP Rocket becomes much more affordable of a solution. If you're not in the market for paying for a plugin, I recommend something like Jetpack Boost. It's a one-click solution that can help improve your site speed. However, it does not provide any of the customizations or caching that some of the other paid options provide. If you're serious about site speed, you will need to pay for some of your plugins. Before we move on, we need to discuss 2 very important rules of thumb. Always test your plugins for compatibility. Check all of your high traffic pages and ensure that your site is operating correctly. And don't enable all settings by default. This can easily break things on your website. It's a much safer solution to enable options one by one and test them as you enable them. Step 8 covers some of the baseline site speed options that apply to every website. Most site speed plugins have options for these, but if yours does not, I highly recommend switching to one that does. You shouldn't have to download multiple plugins to accomplish something that one plugin can do. Many of these settings can be found on my State of Search resources page on my WP Rocket settings link. On that guide, I have screenshots that show exactly how to set up WP Rocket for success. But let's dive into these a little bit. The first one is to minify HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. All this essentially does is remove white space and condenses all of the code into single lines. And this helps the parser move a little bit faster and reduces the overall size of your code on your page. When you do this, test and exclude any files that it breaks. But typically, I rarely see this break anything, so you should be okay, but it's always good to test. The next step is to lazy load your images. And what that means is that your images won't load until a user scrolls down and that image comes into the viewport. However, I do recommend excluding any hero images or any above the fold images from lazy loading. This can help improve your first contentful paint. Your largest contentful paint. Enable lazy loading for iframes. This includes things like YouTube videos. And if you embed YouTube videos, WP Rocket has a really cool feature where instead of loading your YouTube video, which can really hurt your load speed, it actually swaps it out for a preview image. And when you click on that preview image, it auto plays. And for the users, it's seamless. But for browsers, it loads your page much, much faster. Next is to enable Critical Css. And what that does is it takes all the CSS on your page and puts it in the head so that the browser can start painting the page, and it improves any render blocking that happens. Next is some tools like WP Rocket have a feature for removing unused CSS, which tends to happen a lot in like PageSpeed Insights. It'll tell you to remove unused CSS. Now that's a risky move. I say use that setting with caution. Make sure that you test things, and if you use things like pop-ups or recordings or anything that requires a click to generate an action, make sure you test those, because a browser may think that it's unused, but it turns out it's only used once you click something. So again, use that setting with caution. On number 7 here, we see add missing image dimensions. And this can help improve your CLS, which is cumulative layout shift, which we discussed earlier. Number 8 is to disable any automatic preloading. We talked about that just a few slides ago. Number 9 is sync your plugin with the CDN. Many tools like WP Rocket can sync with your CDN if it uses different URLs. Now, if you're using Cloudflare, you can skip that step. It's not necessary. While setting up your site speed plugins, you may come across an option to optimize your JavaScript files by loading them deferred or asynchronously. But what's the difference? On the graphic on this page, we see a representation of a browser parsing some code. And this is a waterfall or a timeline of that browser parsing the code. In the first green block, we see a browser parsing through some HTML in green. And then it stops right about here. And that's when it decides here in purple to start downloading some JavaScript. And then here in red, it starts executing that script. And all during this time here in gray, it stopped parsing the HTML. And then it's continued once the script is done executing. This is what we call render blocking JavaScript, because the process blocks the HTML rendering. One method to fix this is to load your JavaScript asynchronously. This allows the browser to continue parsing while the script downloads, and it only stops parsing while the script is being executed. This can significantly reduce render blocking resources and improve paint, but it still causes some render blocking. Another option is to defer your JavaScript from executing until the rest of the HTML is done parsing. Essentially, this pushes the script to the bottom of the page load so that the script is downloaded while the HTML is parsing, but the script doesn't execute until the very end. One method that's not shown in this graphic is called delaying JavaScript, which is when you delay JavaScript from executing until a user interacts with an element. This is the best way to improve your paint scores in Google Lighthouse. A good example of when to delay a script is when a CTA button generates a pop-up. Since that pop-up only occurs when a user clicks on your CTA button, we can safely delay that script from executing until the user interacts with our CTA button. Delaying JavaScript execution should be plan A, however some websites rely on JavaScript to display certain elements. If delaying JavaScript is causing your website to break or not load correctly, you may need to load your scripts asynchronously or deferred. But if you want to get really fancy, you can delay some scripts and asynchronously load the more critical ones and then defer maybe some of the non-critical ones. But it's all trial and error while we fine tune and dial in our settings. Alright, we finished our housekeeping. It's time to run some more site speed tests and see where we're at. If you run your tests and you're still seeing some additional opportunities or your score still isn't where you want it, don't worry. I have more tips coming up. But first, we need to do a site health checkup. We want to make sure nothing's broken, things are working correctly. We're going to run through a few checklist items. Alright, so we've run some tests, but we still need to test site functionality. Before you dive into any of the other fun, nitty-gritty things and opportunities that are still remaining, we need to test site functionality. That way, we can go ahead and start rolling back some settings before we get too deep. This is really important that we do this now before we're done. So step 1, check for any critical user interactions. Make sure that any pop-ups or clicking actions are happening. Any micro actions. Think about if you hover your mouse over an image or text, if something happens, if there's if things change color upon hover, anything like that. We want to make sure any critical user interactions that happen are still functioning properly. Check your sliders or any JavaScript dependent functions. Make sure that those are still functioning. If any part of your website, whether it's a user sign-on or a form, is using CAPTCHA, make sure that's displaying correctly. It's a common issue I see is that CAPTCHA, whenever you're delaying JavaScript or optimizing CSS, is that CAPTCHA gets messed up and it doesn't display right, or sometimes even doesn't work right. And if you see that happening, all you need to do is exclude CAPTCHA files from being optimized. And then, of course, you want to test form submissions or any kind of CTA action. However users take an action on your website, you want to make sure you test those and make sure that they're functioning properly. Now, if something is broken and you want to exclude those files, what you need to do is right-click on the broken element and select Inspect, which will bring up Chrome DevTools. Then you want to check which files that element is using. You can see which files an element is using in the Style pane. Next, exclude that element from optimization and see if that fixes the problem. Alright, it's time to bring it on home. We verified that our website is still functioning properly and ran some new site speed scores. However, our site speed tests are saying there's still more to be done. Let's go ahead and tackle some of the most common obstacles that site speed tools tell us to fix. Third-party scripts will continue to be a pain for almost every website. However, there is hope. The first step is to delay or defer almost all of your third-party scripts. The only exclusion should be is if your website is using some sort of bootstrap that helps paint your site. In that case, async those scripts. Another option is to create a Cloudflare worker to help cache them. Cloudflare workers make it possible to execute JavaScript on the Cloudflare network. Workers can intercept and modify requests, cache content, combine third-party scripts, and more. A fellow SEO, Jean-Christophe, has created an amazing step-by-step guide on how to set up a Cloudflare worker on this link. Don't fret about copying that down now. I have a link to his guide on my State of Search resources page. I highly recommend you take a look at it. Sometimes, plugins that your website rely on end up being the biggest culprits of site speed issues. A few options you can choose are to use Asset Cleanup Pro or Perf Matters to dequeue those plugin files on pages that don't use them. Maybe delay or async those files if possible. See if there's a way for a developer to manually code an alternative to those plugins. Don't have a developer? Reach out to me on Twitter at SEO Counseling and I'll happily point you in the direction of someone that can help. If none of those are options, check out the WordPress plugins library to see if there's any lightweight alternatives to your plugins. Wysiwyg WordPress themes will forever be the bane of my existence. They are by far the biggest offenders of site speed issues. Unfortunately, there's rarely anything we can do to fix these issues. One option is to try and dequeue unused code on pages that don't use those features, but that's a painstaking process that could end up breaking things in the end. Another nuclear option is to pay a developer to rebuild your website from scratch, but that can be costly and time-consuming. But if you're on a budget and you're a decent designer, you could try SEO Grid. SEO Grid is a free WordPress theme that launched today. I created a fully responsive WordPress theme that is meant to replicate the ease of use of a Wysiwyg WordPress theme, but without all the bloat. On my website, I have full installation instructions, including a walkthrough video on how to get started building your own WordPress site with SEO Grid. The best part? My own website consistently scores a 100 on PageSpeed Insights. Yes, a 100. The cool part? My code is completely open source on GitHub. And I'm actively taking feature requests. So if you don't see a feature you need, just submit a feature request and I might be able to build it for you for free. This is my attempt at putting something useful out there for the community so that we can all contribute to a better web building experience and empower each other to build better. So if you want a free WordPress theme that I created, go to my website and in the menu look at SEO Grid and I will help you get set up building your own responsive website that's lightning fast. Thank you for your time today. Again, if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Twitter at SEO Counseling. If you want to work with me, contact us at cardinaldigitalmarketing.com. And if you want to find the show notes and all the resource links and everything I covered, it's at johnmcalpin.com/SOS2021. Thank you.